The year was 1965, and North Vietnamese pilots couldn't stop laughing. They just spotted an American aircraft lumbering through the skies over Vietnam, a massive, single-propeller dinosaur that looked like it belonged in a World War II museum. While their sleek MiG-21s screamed through the air at over 100 miles per hour, this American relic puttered along at barely 318 mph. It was embarrassing. Here was the mighty United States, the world's most advanced military power, sending antiques to fight a modern war. The Americans called it the A-1 Skyraider, but to everyone else, it was just another piece of evidence that the enemy was getting desperate. What the North Vietnamese didn't know was that this slow, ugly, outdated plane was about to become their worst nightmare. The 1960s belonged to the jet engine. Everything about modern warfare revolved around one simple concept: faster was better. The Cold War had turned aviation into an arms race of pure velocity, where supersonic fighters dominated the skies and propeller-driven aircraft were relics of a bygone era. At the heart of this revolution sat two magnificent beasts of American engineering. The F-4 Phantom II, a twin-engine monster capable of Mach 2.2, represented everything the Pentagon believed about modern air combat. It could climb to 60,000 feet, carry sophisticated radar systems, and launch missiles from distances that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. The F-10F-5 Thunderchief, nicknamed the Thud, was even more impressive. A single-seat fighter bomber that could punch through enemy airspace at nearly twice the speed of sound while carrying a devastating nuclear payload. These weren't just airplanes. They were symbols of American technological supremacy, proof that the United States had mastered the science of warfare. Military doctrine in the early 1960s was crystal clear. Propeller planes were obsolete dinosaurs, destined for the scrapyard of history. The future belonged to jets, missiles, and high-altitude precision bombing. The Pentagon's confidence wasn't just theoretical. The Cold War arms race had pushed aviation technology forward at breakneck speed. Every year brought faster engines, more sophisticated electronics, and deadlier weapon systems. Soviet MiGs were getting faster, so American jets had to be faster still. The entire military-industrial complex was geared toward one goal: achieving total air superiority through speed and altitude. This obsession with velocity shaped everything about American air strategy in Vietnam. The plan was simple and elegant. Fast jets would sweep in at high altitude, deliver precision strikes with guided munitions, and disappear before enemy air defenses could react. It was warfare at the speed of sound, clean and efficient. The F-4 Phantom embodied this philosophy perfectly. With its twin General Electric J79 engines, it could accelerate from 0 to Mach 2 in minutes. Its radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, while its missiles could engage enemies from dozens of miles away. This wasn't dogfighting. This was technological domination. The F-105 Thunderchief took the concept even further. Designed specifically for nuclear strike missions against the Soviet Union, the Thud was a flying missile platform capable of delivering devastating firepower at unprecedented speeds. Its Pratt & Whitney J75 engine produced over 26,000 pounds of thrust, pushing the aircraft through enemy airspace faster than most fighters could intercept. Pentagon planners looked at these magnificent machines and saw the future of warfare. Why would you need a slow, vulnerable propeller plane when you could have a supersonic jet? The math seemed obvious. Speed equals survival, and survival equals victory. The initial deployment of these cutting-edge jets to Vietnam seemed to prove the theory correct. F-4 Phantoms dominated North Vietnamese MiGs in early air-to-air combat, while F-105 Thunderchiefs delivered devastating strikes against strategic targets. The technology was working exactly as designed. But there was a problem brewing in the jungles below, one that the Pentagon's speed-obsessed doctrine hadn't anticipated. Vietnam wasn't the high-altitude, open-terrain conflict that American jets were designed for. It was a close-quarters, low-altitude nightmare where speed became a liability rather than an asset. The F-4 Phantom, for all its technological sophistication, had a fatal flaw in the Vietnamese theater. It was too fast to see what it was shooting at. Flying at 500 meters just above the jungle canopy, pilots had seconds to identify and engage targets hidden beneath triple canopy forest. By the time they spotted something suspicious, they were already miles past it. The F-105 Thunderchief faced similar problems. Its massive fuel consumption meant it could only spend minutes over target areas before having to return for refueling. In a conflict where enemy supply lines moved primarily at night and targets appeared and disappeared within hours, this limitation was crippling. The expectation of quick, clean technological superiority was colliding with the messy reality of jungle warfare. And somewhere in the background, dismissed by nearly everyone as an obsolete relic, sat a slow, ugly, propeller-driven airplane that was about to prove that sometimes older really is better. The A-1 Skyraider looked like a mistake. Standing on the tarmac next to sleek F-4 Phantoms and supersonic F-105 Thunderchiefs, it resembled a museum piece that had wandered onto the wrong runway. This was a massive, single-propeller beast that seemed to belong in grainy World War II newsreels, not the jet-age battlefields of Vietnam. Everything about the Skyraider screamed obsolete. Its enormous Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine, the same power plant that drove B-29 superfortresses over Japan, sat in front of a cockpit that looked positively ancient compared to the glass enclosed fighter jets surrounding it. Where modern aircraft featured clean aerodynamic lines designed for speed, the A-1 was all business: thick wings, massive landing gear, and a profile that suggested brute force over finesse. The plane's origins told the story of a different war entirely. Born in 1945 as the AD-1 Skyraider, it was designed by Douglas Aircraft as a carrier-based torpedo bomber for the final assault on Japan. The Navy wanted something that could carry a devastating payload over long distances while operating from aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Speed wasn't the priority. Hitting hard and staying in the fight was. By the time the A-1 reached production, World War II was over, but the Korean War gave it a chance to prove itself. Flying from carriers off the Korean coast, Skyraiders demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment while delivering precise ground attacks. They could loiter over battlefields for hours, providing close air support that faster jets simply couldn't match. But Korea was supposed to be the Skyraider's swan song. The 1950s brought the jet revolution, and military planners were eager to phase out every propeller-driven aircraft in the inventory. The A-1 survived only through a combination of bureaucratic inertia and the stubborn insistence of a few old-school pilots who understood its unique capabilities. The plane earned its nickname SPAD from these veteran aviators, a reference to the French SPAD biplanes of World War I. It wasn't exactly a compliment. The name suggested something antiquated, a relic from aviation's primitive past, but pilots who flew the A-1 used the term with grudging respect. The SPAD might be ugly and slow, but it was tough as nails. When the Skyraider first arrived in Vietnam in the early 1960s, it was officially designated as a stopgap measure. The plan was simple: use these old planes for basic missions while the real work was handled by modern jets. Nobody expected the A-1 to play a major role in the conflict. It was there to fill gaps, handle secondary targets, and maybe provide some close air support for ground troops. The visual contrast between the Skyraider and its jet-powered contemporaries was almost comical. The F-4 Phantom looked like a spaceship, all sharp angles and gleaming metal. The F-105 Thunderchief resembled a flying missile, sleek and purposeful. Next to these technological marvels, the A-1 looked like their grandfather: thick, slow, and hopelessly outdated. Air Force pilots assigned to fly Skyraiders often felt like they were being punished. After training on supersonic jets, climbing into the cockpit of a propeller plane felt like a step backward in their careers. The controls were heavy, the visibility was limited, and the whole aircraft vibrated with the massive radial engine's power. It was like trading a Ferrari for a bulldozer. But there were hints that this bulldozer might have some unexpected advantages. The A-1's massive wing area and low wing loading meant it could fly slower than any jet without stalling. Its fuel-efficient piston engine could stay airborne for hours while jets burned through their fuel in minutes. And those thick wings could carry an absolutely staggering amount of ordnance. The North Vietnamese certainly didn't take the Skyraider seriously. Intelligence reports from captured documents showed that enemy pilots viewed the A-1 as an easy target, a slow-moving prize that would boost their kill counts. They called it the flying tractor and joked about how their modern MiGs would make quick work of America's antique Air Force. What nobody understood yet, not the Pentagon, not the North Vietnamese, not even most American pilots, was that the Skyraider's apparent weaknesses were actually perfectly suited for the unique challenges of the Vietnam War. The jungle conflict was about to reveal that sometimes the oldest solutions are the best solutions. The North Vietnamese Air Force wasn't just dismissive of the A-1 Skyraider, they were genuinely contemptuous. Captured intelligence documents from 1965 reveal the depth of their mockery. NVA pilots referred to the Skyraider as a Maybay Q, old airplane, and treated encounters with them as target practice rather than legitimate combat. The numbers seemed to support their arrogance. A MiG-21 could reach speeds of 100 km at altitude, while the lumbering Skyraider maxed out at 318 km in level flight. In terms of pure velocity, it wasn't even close. The fastest American propeller plane was slower than some commercial airliners of the era. To pilots trained in supersonic combat, the A-1 represented everything backward about American air power. North Vietnamese propaganda made the most of this technological gap. Radio broadcasts mocked the United States for sending museum pieces to fight a modern war. Communist newspapers ran cartoons showing primitive biplanes attacking sleek, Soviet-built fighters. The message was clear. America was so desperate that they were pulling antiques out of storage. This propaganda wasn't just for show. It reflected genuine tactical planning within the NVA. Military commanders developed air defense strategies that essentially ignored the Skyraider threat. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned to engage fast-moving jets flying predictable high-altitude approaches. Surface-to-air missile sites were programmed for targets traveling at jet speeds. The slow, low-flying A-1 simply didn't register as a priority. Intelligence reports from the period show that NVA tactical manuals barely mentioned propeller-driven aircraft. Training programs for MiG pilots focused entirely on engaging supersonic American fighters. The assumption was that any pilot skilled enough to handle a MiG-17 or MiG-21 could easily dispatch a slow-moving relic from World War II. This overconfidence extended to ground forces as well. NVA supply convoys moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail were trained to scatter when they heard the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching at high speed. But the low, steady rumble of a radial engine barely registered as a threat. Truck drivers who would immediately seek cover from an F-4 Phantom continued driving when they heard a Skyraider overhead. The North Vietnamese made a fundamental error in their threat assessment. They measured danger purely by speed and altitude, missing the crucial factors that would make the A-1 so devastating in the Vietnamese theater. While they prepared for high-speed, high-altitude intercepts, they left themselves completely vulnerable to low and slow attacks. Communist air defense doctrine was built around Soviet principles designed for European battlefields. Fast jets would approach at high altitude, deliver their ordnance quickly, and retreat before ground defenses could react. This made perfect sense when facing NATO forces equipped with similar aircraft and tactics. But Vietnam wasn't Europe, and the Skyraider wasn't playing by Soviet rules. The NVA's contempt blinded them to the A-1's actual capabilities. While they focused on the plane's slow speed, they ignored its massive payload capacity. While they mocked its outdated appearance, they missed its extraordinary endurance. While they prepared for brief high-speed attacks, they left themselves exposed to hours of sustained assault. Perhaps, most critically, North Vietnamese commanders failed to understand the psychological impact of the Skyraider's persistence. A jet attack was terrifying but brief, a few minutes of intense danger followed by relief. The A-1 was different. It could circle a target area for hours, creating a constant state of terror among ground forces who never knew when the next attack would come. The intelligence failure went both ways. American commanders initially shared the NVA's assessment of the Skyraider as obsolete. The plane was assigned to secondary missions precisely because nobody expected it to play a major role against a modern enemy. This mutual underestimation created a perfect storm of tactical surprise. By late 1965, that contempt was beginning to shift. NVA after-action reports started mentioning devastating attacks by slow-moving aircraft that seemed immune to conventional air defenses. Supply convoys that had operated with impunity were being systematically destroyed by planes that could track them for hours through the jungle canopy. The laughter was about to stop. The North Vietnamese had made the fatal mistake of judging their enemy by appearance rather than capability, and they were about to pay a terrible price for that arrogance. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine that powered the A-1 Skyraider wasn't just big. It was a 2,700 horsepower monster that had been designed to push massive B-29 bombers across the Pacific. This wasn't some lightweight power plant optimized for fuel economy. This was raw, brutal power wrapped in 18 cylinders of American engineering. Fury. The engine alone weighed over 2,600 pounds, nearly as much as some entire fighter aircraft from earlier wars. Its twin rows of 9 cylinders each generated a sound that was unmistakable, a deep, throaty roar that announced the Skyraider's presence from miles away. While jets screamed through the sky with high-pitched whines, the A-1 rumbled overhead like rolling thunder, a constant reminder that something deadly was circling above. But the real genius of the Skyraider wasn't in its engine. It was in what that engine could carry. The aircraft featured 15 external hardpoints, attachment locations where weapons could be mounted beneath the wings and fuselage. This wasn't just impressive for a single-engine aircraft, it was unprecedented. Most fighter jets of the era could carry ordnance on 4 or 6 hardpoints. The A-1 nearly tripled that capacity. The payload numbers were staggering. A fully loaded Skyraider could carry over 8,000 pounds of external ordnance, more than the famous B-17 Flying Fortress bombers that had pounded Nazi Germany. Think about that for a moment. A single-seat, single-engine aircraft from the 1940s could deliver more destructive power than the 4-engine strategic bombers that had won World War II. This wasn't an accident of design. The Navy had specifically requested an aircraft that could function as a flying dump truck, capable of delivering overwhelming firepower to support amphibious operations in the Pacific. The Douglas engineers who created the A-1 built it around this philosophy of maximum ordnance delivery, sacrificing speed and maneuverability for raw destructive capacity. The variety of weapons the Skyraider could carry was equally impressive. Its 4 20mm cannons provided devastating strafing capability, each cannon firing explosive shells at 750 rounds per minute. But that was just the beginning. The external hardpoints could accommodate everything from 500-pound general-purpose bombs to 2,000-pound blockbusters capable of leveling entire buildings. Rocket pods were another favorite. The A-1 could carry multiple pods loaded with 2.75-inch folding-fin aerial rockets, turning the aircraft into a flying artillery battery. Each rocket carried a high-explosive warhead that could penetrate armor or demolish fortifications. A single Skyraider could fire dozens of these rockets in a matter of seconds, saturating target areas with devastating precision fire. Napalm canisters were perhaps the most feared weapon in the A-1's arsenal. These jellied gasoline bombs could clear entire jungle areas, burning through thick vegetation to expose hidden enemy positions. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The sight of napalm spreading across the landscape struck terror into enemy forces who knew they had nowhere to hide. Cluster bombs added another dimension to the Skyraider's destructive capabilities. These weapons would split open in mid-air, scattering hundreds of smaller bomblets across wide areas. They were perfect for attacking dispersed targets like supply convoys or troop concentrations, turning a single bomb into a devastating area weapon. The most famous example of the A-1's versatility came during Operation Toilet Bowl, when a Skyraider pilot actually dropped a toilet on enemy positions. The incident wasn't just a joke. It demonstrated that the aircraft could literally carry anything that could be strapped to its hardpoints. If it could be attached to the plane, the Skyraider could deliver it to the target. This flying dump truck philosophy stood in stark contrast to the jet aircraft of the era. The F-4 Phantom, for all its speed and sophistication, was severely limited by fuel constraints. Its twin jet engines consumed fuel at an enormous rate, forcing pilots to choose between carrying extra fuel tanks or carrying weapons. The F-105 Thunderchief faced similar limitations. Its massive internal fuel consumption meant that external ordnance had to be balanced against range requirements. The Skyraider suffered from no such limitations. Its fuel-efficient piston engine could carry maximum ordnance loads without sacrificing range or endurance. This meant that every A-1 that reached the target area arrived with its full destructive potential intact, ready to deliver sustained, overwhelming firepower for hours rather than minutes. The aircraft's construction philosophy reinforced this approach. Where jets were built for speed using lightweight aluminum and exotic materials, the Skyraider was built like a tank. Heavy steel armor protected the pilot and critical systems, while redundant control systems ensured that the aircraft could continue fighting even after sustaining significant battle damage. This wasn't elegant engineering. It was brutal, practical design focused on one goal: delivering maximum destruction to the enemy while bringing the pilot home alive. While jets were being built as aluminum speed machines designed to outrun threats, the A-1 Skyraider was constructed like a flying tank. The difference in philosophy was stark. Where modern aircraft relied on speed and altitude for protection, the Skyraider depended on armor plating and sheer toughness to survive in combat. The pilot sat surrounded by heavy steel armor that could stop rifle bullets and shell fragments. This wasn't thin aluminum sheeting like you'd find on a jet fighter. This was genuine battle armor, thick enough to deflect direct hits from ground fire. The armor extended around the engine compartment, protecting the massive radial power plant from small arms fire that would cripple lighter aircraft. Jet fighters of the Vietnam era were marvels of engineering, but they had a fatal vulnerability. Their aluminum construction was optimized for weight savings and aerodynamic efficiency, not battlefield survival. A single lucky shot from an AK-47 could puncture fuel lines, sever control cables, or damage critical systems. The high-speed, high-altitude environment that jets were designed for simply didn't include provisions for absorbing ground fire. The F-4 Phantom, despite its impressive speed and firepower, was essentially a flying egg, hard on the outside, but catastrophically vulnerable once that shell was cracked. Its twin engines were powerful but delicate, requiring precise fuel flow and temperature control. Damage to any critical component would send the aircraft tumbling from the sky, often too fast and too high for the crew to survive ejection. The A-1 Skyraider operated on completely different principles. Its massive Wright R3350 engine was designed for reliability over refinement. This was the same power plant that had carried B-29 bombers on 14-hour missions over the Pacific, built to run hot, run hard, and keep running even when damaged. Individual cylinders could be shot out without stopping the engine, and the aircraft could continue flying on reduced power. Pilot testimonies from Vietnam tell incredible stories of Skyraiders returning to base with damage that would have destroyed any jet aircraft. Captain John Smith described his A-1 after a particularly brutal mission over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. "I counted over 300 holes in the wings and fuselage. The armor had stopped at least a dozen direct hits that would have killed me in any other plane. One engine cylinder was completely shot away, but the old girl just kept flying." The aircraft's fuel system was another marvel of defensive engineering. Self-sealing fuel tanks would automatically close small punctures, preventing the catastrophic fuel leaks that doomed so many aircraft. Multiple fuel lines and pumps provided redundancy. If one system failed, others could take over. This was critical in an environment where fuel fires were a constant threat. Maintenance crews at Vietnamese air bases developed an almost mystical respect for the Skyraider's durability. Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, who worked on A-1s at Bien Hoa Air Base, remembered aircraft returning from missions that should have been impossible to survive. "We'd see SPADs come back looking like Swiss cheese, holes everywhere, control surfaces shot up, and the pilot would just taxi up to the ramp like nothing happened. Try that with an F-4, and you'd have a smoking crater." The psychological advantage of flying an unkillable plane cannot be overstated. Jet pilots knew that a single hit could end their mission, or their lives. They had to rely on speed and altitude to avoid engagement entirely. Skyraider pilots could afford to get down in the weeds, to mix it up with ground defenses, because they knew their aircraft could absorb punishment and keep fighting. This durability extended beyond just armor plating. The A-1's control systems used mechanical linkages rather than the hydraulic systems common in jets. If hydraulic fluid leaked out of a damaged jet, the pilot lost control of the aircraft. The Skyraiders' mechanical controls might become heavy and sluggish when damaged, but they would continue to function. The aircraft's low stall speed was another survival advantage. A damaged jet had to maintain high speed to stay airborne, making emergency landings extremely dangerous. The Skyraider could slow down to barely 60 mph and still maintain controlled flight, allowing pilots to nurse damaged aircraft back to friendly territory even with significant battle damage. Enemy forces quickly learned to respect this durability. North Vietnamese gunners discovered that shooting at a Skyraider was like attacking a flying fortress. You might hit it, you might even damage it severely, but you probably wouldn't stop it. This psychological factor became as important as the physical protection, creating a reputation for invincibility that preceded every A-1 mission. The Skyraider had become the guardian angel of American forces in Vietnam, not through speed or sophistication, but through the simple, brutal effectiveness of being too tough to kill. The F-4 Phantom could scream across the Vietnamese landscape at 1,500 mph. But it could only stay over a target area for about 4 minutes before its fuel gauges started flashing red. The F-105 Thunderchief was even worse. Its massive afterburning engine guzzled fuel so fast that pilots had barely enough time to identify targets, drop their ordnance, and race back to base before running dry. This was the fatal flaw of jet-powered warfare in Vietnam. Speed meant nothing if you couldn't stay in the fight long enough to use it effectively. While American jets were burning through thousands of gallons of fuel per hour, the A-1 Skyraider was sipping gas like a Sunday driver, its fuel-efficient piston engine consuming a fraction of what the jets required. The operational numbers tell the story. A fully fueled F-4 Phantom could stay airborne for about 2 hours total, but only if it avoided afterburner use and carried minimal ordnance. Factor in the time needed to reach the target area and return to base, and you're looking at maybe 10 to 15 minutes of actual combat time. The Skyraider, by contrast, could patrol a target area for 4 to 6 hours without breaking a sweat. This endurance advantage transformed the nature of air warfare in Vietnam. Jets had to operate on rigid schedules, arrive at a predetermined time, attack predetermined targets, and leave before fuel ran out. There was no flexibility, no opportunity to adapt to changing conditions on the ground. If the enemy wasn't exactly where intelligence said they'd be, the mission was a failure. The Skyraider operated under completely different rules. A-1 pilots could afford to hunt, to circle an area for hours looking for targets of opportunity. They could wait for the perfect moment to strike, then circle back for additional passes if needed. This patience turned every Skyraider mission into a prolonged nightmare for enemy forces below. Ground troops learned to fear the distinctive sound of the Wright ER-3350 engine. Unlike the brief, terrifying scream of a jet passing overhead, the Skyraider's rumble was constant, persistent, inescapable. North Vietnamese soldiers described the psychological torture of knowing that death was circling overhead, that at any moment those 20mm cannons could open up or those bombs could start falling. The fuel efficiency of the piston engine was only part of the equation. The A-1's design philosophy emphasized endurance over speed in every aspect. Its massive wing area provided excellent lift at low speeds, allowing the aircraft to loiter at minimum fuel consumption. The pilot could throttle back to barely 150 knots and still maintain controlled flight, stretching fuel reserves even further. This created a tactical advantage that no jet could match. While F-4 pilots had to make split-second decisions about target engagement, Skyraider pilots could take their time. They could make multiple reconnaissance passes, study the terrain, identify escape routes, and plan their attacks with methodical precision. The enemy below had no choice but to wait and watch as death circled overhead. The psychological impact extended beyond just enemy forces. American ground troops came to view the Skyraider's persistent presence as a security blanket. Marines pinned down by enemy fire knew that as long as they could hear that radial engine overhead, help was available. The A-1 wouldn't disappear after a single strafing run like the jets did. It would stay and fight for as long as needed. This hunter mentality versus sprinter mentality defined the difference between jet and propeller warfare in Vietnam. Jets were sprinters, fast, powerful, but limited by their need to conserve energy for the race back home. The Skyraider was a marathon runner, content to maintain a steady pace while outlasting every opponent. Enemy supply convoys learned this lesson the hard way. A truck column might successfully hide from a high-speed jet attack, waiting in concealment until the aircraft disappeared over the horizon. But the Skyraider didn't disappear. It circled, waited, watched. Eventually, the convoy would have to move, and when it did, the A-1 would be there, ready to pounce with hours of fuel and ordnance still available. The loitering death had arrived in Vietnam, and it wore the humble disguise of an obsolete propeller plane. The F-4 Phantom screamed over the triple canopy jungle at 500 mph, its pilot scanning desperately for targets below. At that speed, he had maybe 3 seconds to spot, identify, and engage anything moving beneath the dense foliage. By the time his brain processed what his eyes might have seen, he was already 5 miles past the target area, racing toward empty sky with his fuel gauges dropping toward the red zone. This was the brutal reality of jet warfare in the Vietnamese jungle. Aircraft designed for high-altitude intercepts over European battlefields were fundamentally mismatched for the close-quarters, camouflaged nightmare of Southeast Asian combat. The speed that made jets so deadly in open terrain became a fatal liability in the dense forests of Vietnam. The numbers were damning. F-105 Thunderchief pilots reported target acquisition rates of less than 30% on jungle missions. They were flying too fast to see what they were shooting at, dropping ordnance on grid coordinates rather than actual targets. Most bombs fell harmlessly into empty forest, while enemy supply convoys continued moving just miles away, hidden beneath vegetation that looked identical from 20,000 feet. High-speed strafing runs were even worse. A jet pilot diving at 400 mph had a firing window measured in fractions of seconds. The 20mm cannons on an F-4 could pump out devastating firepower, but only if they were aimed at something real. Too often, pilots found themselves strafing shadows, suspicious-looking clearings, or patches of disturbed earth that turned out to be nothing more than natural variations in the jungle canopy. The fuel consumption crisis made everything worse. Jet engines burned fuel at astronomical rates, especially when maneuvering at low altitude where the air was thick and engines had to work harder. An F-4 on a close air support mission might have only 8 to 10 minutes over the target area before fuel concerns forced a retreat. If the pilot couldn't find his target in those precious few minutes, the mission was a complete failure. Compare this to the A-1 Skyraider's approach to the same problem. Flying at 150 knots just above the jungle canopy, Skyraider pilots had all the time in the world to study the terrain below. They could spot the subtle signs that revealed enemy activity: fresh tire tracks in the mud, wisps of cooking smoke, the unnatural straight lines of camouflage structures. What looked like impenetrable green hell from a jet's cockpit revealed its secrets to the patient eye of a slow-flying observer. The A-1's low-speed precision advantage was revolutionary in this environment. A Skyraider pilot could make multiple attack passes on a single target, adjusting his approach based on what he learned from each previous run. If the first pass revealed a camouflage bunker, the second pass could deliver a precise napalm strike. If enemy troops scattered into the jungle, the third pass could hunt them down with rockets and cannon fire. Visual reconnaissance at treetop level became the Skyraider's specialty. Flying low enough to see individual soldiers, pilots could distinguish between enemy forces and innocent civilians, a critical capability in a conflict where the battle lines were never clear. Jet pilots dropping bombs from high altitude had no such luxury, leading to tragic mistakes that turned potential allies into enemies. The irony was inescapable. The most advanced military in human history was being outfought by an enemy using tactics and technology from previous centuries. North Vietnamese supply convoys moved at night using bicycles and ox carts, invisible to sophisticated radar systems, but perfectly visible to a pilot flying low and slow with nothing more than his own eyes and experience. Enemy forces adapted their tactics to exploit the jet's limitations. They learned the timing of high-speed attacks, taking cover when they heard the distinctive whine of approaching jets and emerging from concealment as soon as the aircraft passed. The predictable nature of jet operations, fast approach, quick attack, immediate departure, made them easy to avoid. The Skyraider shattered these comfortable patterns. Its unpredictable flight profile and extended loiter time meant enemy forces never knew when an attack might come. A convoy that successfully hid from a morning jet strike might find itself under sustained assault from an A-1 that had been patiently circling the area for hours, waiting for movement. The obsolete technology was proving superior to cutting-edge innovation, and the Pentagon was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to take notice. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just a road. It was a living, breathing organism that snaked through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia like the circulatory system of the North Vietnamese war effort. This wasn't some simple supply route that could be cut with a few well-placed bombs. This was a masterpiece of military engineering that had been decades in the making, a network so complex and resilient that it would challenge every assumption American planners had about modern warfare. The trail began as little more than footpaths used by Viet Minh fighters during the French colonial period, but by 1965 it had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Engineers had carved truck-worthy roads through seemingly impassable terrain, complete with bridges, fuel depots, repair facilities, and underground bunkers that could hide entire supply convoys from aerial observation. The main arteries stretched over 1,000 miles from North Vietnam to the Mekong Delta, with thousands of miles of secondary routes, alternate paths, and emergency detours. What made the trail so formidable wasn't just its size. It was the ingenuity of its construction. North Vietnamese engineers had studied American bombing patterns and designed their supply network to survive sustained aerial assault. Critical bridges were built just below the waterline, invisible to pilots flying overhead, but perfectly functional for trucks equipped with snorkels. Supply depots were carved into hillsides and camouflaged so effectively that they looked like natural rock formations from the air. The camouflage techniques were works of art. Truck parks were covered with living vegetation that was watered and maintained to look completely natural. Fuel storage areas were disguised as rice paddies, with bamboo pipes running fuel lines beneath fake water surfaces. Even the roads themselves were designed to disappear. Sections could be covered with brush and fallen logs during daylight hours, then cleared for night traffic in a matter of minutes. But the trail's greatest strength was its redundancy. American intelligence estimated that for every mile of road they could see from the air, there were at least 3 miles of alternate routes hidden beneath the jungle canopy. Destroy one bridge, and traffic would immediately reroute through 2 backup crossings. Crater one section of road, and repair crews would have it operational again within hours, while convoys used parallel paths that had been prepared months in advance. The repair capabilities were staggering. North Vietnamese work crews had turned road maintenance into a military science. They could fill bomb craters, rebuild bridges, and clear landslides with a speed that frustrated American planners who expected their airstrikes to create lasting disruption. What looked like devastating damage from the cockpit of a departing bomber would be completely repaired by the time the next mission arrived 12 hours later. The trail's defenses were equally impressive. The North Vietnamese had learned from bitter experience that their supply lines were the most vulnerable part of their war effort. They responded by turning the entire route into a gauntlet of anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, and small arms positions. Flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just dangerous. It was suicidal for aircraft that couldn't absorb heavy ground fire. The psychological impact of the trail extended far beyond its military function. For American forces, it represented the enemy's ability to sustain a war indefinitely. No matter how many trucks were destroyed, how many supply depots were bombed, or how many bridges were dropped, the supplies kept flowing south. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more would grow back. Intelligence reports from the period reveal American frustration with the trail's resilience. Despite dropping more ordnance on Laos and Cambodia than had been used in all of World War II, the supply flow continued unabated. Sophisticated sensors, high-altitude reconnaissance, and even ground-based special operations teams couldn't seem to make a lasting impact on the enemy's logistics network. Previous attempts to stop the flow using conventional jet aircraft had been spectacular failures. F-105 Thunder Chiefs would roar in at high speed, drop their bombs on predetermined coordinates, and race away before ground defenses could react. But they were bombing empty jungle most of the time, hitting decoy targets or striking roads that would be repaired within hours. The trail had become the ultimate test of interdiction warfare, the military art of cutting enemy supply lines. Every advanced weapon system in the American arsenal had been tried and found wanting. High-altitude bombers couldn't see through the jungle canopy. Fast jets couldn't loiter long enough to find real targets. Even the most sophisticated electronic sensors couldn't distinguish between genuine supply convoys and elaborate decoys. This was the challenge that would define the Vietnam War's air campaign. The Ho Chi Minh Trail represented everything that was wrong with American assumptions about modern warfare. The belief that technology could substitute for persistence, that speed could overcome patience, and that sophisticated weapons could defeat simple but effective tactics. The trail was waiting for an aircraft that could match its persistence with its own, that could hunt patiently through the jungle canopy until it found real targets, and that could deliver sustained, devastating attacks that couldn't be quickly repaired. The trail was waiting for the Skyraider. The Pentagon finally acknowledged what pilots in the field had been saying for months. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was bleeding American air power dry. Traditional interdiction campaigns had thrown everything at the supply network. B-52 strategic bombers, F-105 fighter bombers, even experimental electronic warfare aircraft. Nothing worked. The trail kept flowing, and American frustration kept mounting. In late 1965, military planners launched Operation Steel Tiger, a sustained campaign designed to cut the trail once and for all. The operation would coordinate airstrikes across multiple services, using every available aircraft type in a comprehensive assault on North Vietnamese logistics. It was supposed to be the definitive answer to the supply line problem. Initially, the A-1 Skyraider was relegated to a supporting role in Steel Tiger operations. The real work would be handled by the fast jets, F-4 Phantoms providing air superiority, F-105 Thunder Chiefs delivering heavy ordnance, and sophisticated electronic warfare aircraft suppressing enemy air defenses. The old propeller planes would handle cleanup missions, secondary targets, and maybe some close air support for special operations teams. But the jungle had other plans. Within weeks of Steel Tiger's launch, it became clear that the jets were struggling with the same problems that had plagued earlier interdiction efforts. High-speed bombing runs were hitting empty forest, while real supply convoys moved undetected just miles away. The sophisticated radar and electronic systems that worked perfectly in open terrain were useless beneath the triple canopy. Forward air controllers, the pilots who flew small observation aircraft to spot targets for the fast jets, began requesting Skyraider support with increasing frequency. They'd found supply depots, truck parks, or moving convoys, but by the time the F-4s or F-105s arrived on station, the targets had vanished back into the jungle. They needed aircraft that could hunt patiently, that could wait for targets to reveal themselves. The A-1's secondary role quickly became primary mission. Skyraider pilots found themselves flying more interdiction sorties than close air support missions, spending long hours prowling the trail network looking for signs of enemy activity. This was detective work at 150 knots, requiring skills that no jet pilot had ever needed to develop. Learning to hunt ghost convoys required a complete rethinking of aerial reconnaissance. Skyraider pilots had to become jungle experts, studying the subtle patterns that revealed human activity beneath the canopy. Fresh tire tracks in muddy stream crossings, wisps of smoke from cooking fires, the unnatural geometry of camouflaged structures. Most importantly, they had to learn patience, the ability to circle an area for hours, waiting for movement that might last only minutes. The techniques developed during early Steel Tiger operations became the foundation for all future trail interdiction. Pilots learned to fly systematic search patterns, covering every square mile of suspected supply routes with methodical precision. They studied aerial photographs taken at different times of day, looking for shadows and light patterns that might reveal hidden roads or storage areas. Coordination with forward air controllers became an art form. The FACs, flying their small Cessna 01 bird dogs, would spot suspicious activity and call in the Skyraiders for detailed investigation. The A-1 pilots would make low, slow passes over the target area, using their superior visibility and loiter time to confirm whether the target was real or just another elaborate decoy. The coordination process required split-second timing and absolute trust between aircrew members. FACs would mark targets with smoke rockets, then guide the heavily armed Skyraiders to the precise location. The A-1 pilots had to trust that the FAC's target identification was accurate, while the FAC had to trust that the Skyraider could deliver ordnance precisely enough to avoid hitting friendly forces or innocent civilians. Early successes proved the concept viable and revolutionary. A single Skyraider, guided by an experienced FAC, could accomplish what entire squadrons of jets had failed to achieve. The first confirmed destruction of a major supply depot by an A-1 sent shockwaves through both American and North Vietnamese command structures. The depot had been operating for months under the noses of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. Sophisticated camouflage and careful operational security had kept it hidden from every advanced sensor system in the American inventory. But a patient Skyraider pilot, flying low and slow over the area for 3 hours, spotted the telltale signs of vehicle movement beneath the canopy. The resulting attack was devastating and precise. The A-1 could place its ordnance exactly where it would do the most damage, then circle back for additional passes to ensure complete destruction. By the time the smoke cleared, months of accumulated supplies had been reduced to burning wreckage, and the trail had lost one of its most important logistics nodes. Word spread quickly through the pilot community. The old SPAD was finally proving its worth. Captain Mike "Sabre" Johnson had been circling the same 10-square-mile patch of Laotian jungle for 2.5 hours when he finally saw it. A flash of movement beneath the canopy that lasted maybe 3 seconds. Most pilots would have missed it entirely, but Johnson had developed the patience of a hunting cat during his months flying interdiction missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The movement was subtle, just a brief glimpse of something dark crossing a small clearing about 4 miles northeast of his current position. It could have been anything: a water buffalo, a farmer with an ox cart, or maybe just shadows playing tricks on tired eyes. But Johnson had learned to trust his instincts, and something about that movement felt wrong. He banked his A-1 Skyraider into a gentle turn, throttling back to minimum cruise speed as he approached the area. This was the art of ghost truck hunting. Flying slow enough to see everything, patient enough to wait for confirmation, and experienced enough to distinguish between genuine targets and the 1,000 false alarms that littered every mission. The jungle below looked impenetrable from 1,500 feet. Triple canopy forest stretched in every direction, an unbroken green carpet that had swallowed countless airstrikes without revealing its secrets. But Johnson had been flying these missions long enough to read the subtle signs that most pilots missed, the way certain trees grew in slightly different patterns, the geometric regularity of clearings that looked natural but weren't quite right, the faint lines that might be roads or might be streams or might be nothing at all. He made his first pass at 140 knots, just above stall speed, studying the terrain with methodical precision. Nothing obvious jumped out at him, but that didn't mean anything. The North Vietnamese had turned camouflage into an art form, creating supply routes that were literally invisible from the air until you knew exactly what to look for. The second pass revealed more details. There, a section of jungle where the vegetation looked slightly different, more uniform than the natural chaos that surrounded it. The trees were the right species, the right height, even the right color. But they were planted in rows that were just a little too perfect. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to make this area look natural, which meant it definitely wasn't. Johnson keyed his radio to contact the forward air controller, who had originally spotted suspicious activity in this grid square. Nail 32, this is Sabre 41. I've got possible camouflage structures at coordinates Tango Lima 847293, requesting permission for low-level reconnaissance. The FAC's response crackled through his headset. Roger, Sabre 41, you're cleared for low-level recce. Be advised, we've had reports of heavy NNOA in that area. Keep your head on a swivel. Anti-aircraft artillery was always a concern over the trail, but the A-1's armor and low speed actually gave it advantages in flak-heavy environments. The Skyraider could absorb hits that would destroy a jet, and its slow speed made it a difficult target for gunners trained to engage fast-moving aircraft. Johnson dropped down to 500 feet for his third pass, low enough to see individual tree branches, but high enough to avoid small arms fire from the ground. This was the dangerous part, the moment when patience had to give way to aggression, when the hunter revealed himself to his prey. The camouflage was impressive, but it wasn't perfect. Flying this low, Johnson could see the subtle inconsistencies that revealed human construction beneath the natural facade. Support posts disguised as tree trunks, roof lines hidden beneath living vegetation. Most tellingly, the geometric patterns of vehicle tracks that had been covered with brush, but not completely erased. Then he saw them. Actual trucks parked beneath the camouflage, their dark shapes barely visible through gaps in the overhead cover. This wasn't just a supply depot. It was an active truck park with what looked like an entire convoy taking shelter during daylight hours. Johnson's heart rate spiked as he counted vehicles. 6, 8, 12 trucks, plus what looked like fuel tankers and supply trailers. This was a major find, the kind of target that could justify weeks of patient hunting. But he had to be absolutely certain before calling in the strike. The fourth pass confirmed what he'd suspected. Heat shimmer rising from recently used engines, fresh tire tracks leading into and out of the camouflaged area. Human figures moving between the vehicles, tiny dots that scattered for cover as the Skyraider's engine noise announced his presence. Nail 32, Sabre 41. I've got positive identification on a major truck park. Count 12 to 15 vehicles with personnel, requesting immediate strike authorization. The response was immediate. Sabre 41, you are cleared hot. Make it count. Johnson climbed to 2,000 feet and rolled into his attack run. This was the moment that made all the patient hunting worthwhile, the chance to deliver devastating, precise firepower against a target that mattered. His Skyraider carried a full load of 500-pound bombs, 2.7 and 5-inch rockets, and 20mm cannon ammunition. Enough destruction to turn that truck park into a smoking crater. The first bomb hit dead center in the vehicle concentration, sending a massive fireball mushrooming above the jungle canopy. The stretch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that American pilots called the Barrel wasn't named for its shape. It was named for what happened to you when you flew through it. This was the most heavily defended section of the entire supply network, a 20-mile gauntlet of concentrated anti-aircraft batteries that had been turning American aircraft into flaming wreckage for months. The North Vietnamese had learned from bitter experience that certain sections of the trail were absolutely critical to their war effort. These choke points, river crossings, mountain passes, and supply hubs couldn't be rerouted or bypassed like other parts of the network. They had to be defended at all costs, and the NVA had turned defense into a deadly science. The Barrel contained the highest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in Southeast Asia outside of Hanoi itself. Soviet-supplied 23mm and 57mm guns were positioned in carefully coordinated fields of fire, creating overlapping kill zones that could reach aircraft at any altitude. Surface-to-air missile sites added another layer of lethality. Their radar-guided SA-2 guideline missiles capable of tracking and destroying targets at ranges up to 20 miles. But it wasn't just the quantity of weapons that made the Barrel so dangerous. It was the quality of the crews manning them. The NVA had positioned their most experienced gunners in these critical positions, veterans who had been shooting at American aircraft since the early days of the conflict. They knew the flight patterns, the attack profiles, and the escape routes that American pilots typically used. Flying through the Barrel in a high-speed jet was terrifying, but brief. F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs would streak through the defended area at maximum velocity, hoping their speed would carry them through the flak before the gunners could track them effectively. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The wreckage of dozens of jets littered the jungle floor beneath the Barrel, testament to the deadly effectiveness of concentrated air defenses. The A-1 Skyraider faced a completely different challenge in the Barrel. Its slow speed made it an easier target for anti-aircraft guns, but it also made it a more difficult target for surface-to-air missiles designed to intercept fast-moving jets. The SA-2 guidance systems often couldn't lock onto the Skyraider's low-speed, low-altitude flight profile, causing missiles to overshoot or lose track entirely. More importantly, the A-1's mission profile in the Barrel was fundamentally different from the jets. While F-4s and F-105s were trying to race through the defended area as quickly as possible, Skyraiders were often assigned Iron Hand missions, deliberately flying into the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire to suppress enemy gun positions before the main strike force arrived. This was perhaps the most dangerous job in military aviation. Iron Hand pilots would fly directly at known gun positions, drawing fire and marking targets for follow-up strikes. They were human bait, using themselves as lures to reveal the locations of camouflaged anti-aircraft sites. The mission required nerves of steel and an aircraft tough enough to absorb massive amounts of ground fire. Captain Tom Hammer Williams flew more Iron Hand missions over the barrel than any other pilot in his squadron. His A-1 had been hit by ground fire on every single mission, accumulating battle damage that would have grounded any other aircraft type. Flying into the barrel was like flying into hell, Williams remembered. You could see the muzzle flashes from dozens of guns, all aimed at you. The flak was so thick you could almost walk on it. The Skyraider's armor and redundant systems made it uniquely suited for this suicidal mission profile. Where a single hit could bring down a jet, the A-1 could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. Williams's aircraft once returned from a barrel mission with over 200 holes in the wings and fuselage, one engine cylinder completely shot away, and hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple punctures. It still flew well enough to make a normal landing. The psychological effect on enemy gunners was significant. They were accustomed to jets that would streak overhead once and disappear. The Skyraider would circle back for multiple passes, seemingly immune to the concentrated fire directed at it. Gun crews would watch in disbelief as aircraft they'd hit multiple times continued attacking, dropping ordnance with methodical precision despite obvious battle damage. This persistence broke the morale of many anti-aircraft crews. The knowledge that their most accurate fire couldn't stop the slow-moving attackers created a sense of helplessness that spread through the defensive network. Some gun positions were abandoned after sustained Skyraider attacks, their crews unwilling to face aircraft that seemed impossible to kill. The calculated risk of low-altitude attack runs in the barrel required split-second decision-making under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable. The radio crackled with desperation in Captain Dave Wolfpack Morrison's headset. Any station, this is Bravo Company. We are pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. Grid coordinates 847295. We need immediate close air support. We have wounded. Morrison was already banking his A-1 Skyraider toward the coordinates, but this was the moment that separated the Skyraider from every jet in the American inventory. The Marines below weren't asking for bombs dropped from 20,000 feet onto predetermined coordinates. They needed precision firepower delivered within yards of their own positions, and they needed it now. Flying close air support in Vietnam wasn't like the textbook scenarios pilots trained for in peacetime. There were no clear battle lines, no obvious distinction between friendly and enemy positions. American troops and North Vietnamese forces were often separated by distances measured in meters rather than miles, mixed together in a deadly embrace that made traditional airstrikes impossible. The F-4 Phantom pilots, who tried to provide close air support, faced an impossible challenge. Flying at 400 mph, they had seconds to identify targets, distinguish between friendlies and enemies, and deliver ordnance with surgical precision. The margin for error was zero. A bomb dropped 50 yards too far could wipe out an entire squad of Marines. Most jet pilots simply couldn't make those split-second decisions with the accuracy required. Morrison throttled back to 120 knots as he approached the target area, slow enough to see individual soldiers moving through the jungle below. This was the Skyraider's greatest advantage in close air support. The ability to fly slow enough to actually see what was happening on the ground to make real-time assessments of the tactical situation. Bravo Company, this is Sabre 23. I've got you in sight. Can you mark your position with smoke? Yellow smoke began rising from a small clearing about 200 meters from a tree line where muzzle flashes were clearly visible. Morrison could see the Marines huddled behind fallen logs and in shallow depressions, pinned down by at least 3 enemy machine gun positions. The range was close, maybe 75 yards between friendlies and enemies. This was where the Skyraider's precision capabilities really shone. Morrison could literally talk to the ground controller, making real-time adjustments to his attack based on what he could see from the cockpit. "Bravo, Company. I see your smoke. Enemy positions are in the tree line directly north of your location. Can you give me a reference point for the nearest hostile position?" "Sabre 23, there's a large dead tree about 50 meters north of our smoke. The machine gun is maybe 20 meters east of that tree." Morrison made a shallow dive toward the target, his 20mm cannons already armed and ready. At this low speed and altitude, he could place his fire with rifle-like precision, walking his cannon rounds directly onto the enemy position while staying well clear of the Marines below. The explosive shells tore through the jungle, silencing the first machine gun nest in a matter of seconds. "Sabre 23, that's a direct hit. Can you engage the position about 100 meters further east?" The second attack run was even more precise. Morrison could see enemy soldiers running between positions, and he adjusted his aim in real time to intercept them. His rockets streaked into the jungle with devastating accuracy, each one guided by direct visual contact with the target. But it was the napalm delivery that truly demonstrated the Skyraider's close air support mastery. The jellied gasoline bombs required perfect placement, close enough to clear enemy bunkers, far enough from friendlies to avoid casualties. Morrison's third pass dropped 2 napalm canisters exactly where they needed to go, the burning fuel spreading through the enemy positions while leaving the Marines completely unharmed. "Sabre 23, you just saved our asses. All enemy positions neutralized. We're moving to evacuate wounded." Jets simply couldn't provide this level of precision support. Their speed made real-time target adjustment impossible, and their limited loiter time meant they couldn't stay in the area to provide sustained fire support. The trust between ground, troops and Skyraider pilots was absolute. They knew the A-1 could deliver devastating firepower exactly where it was needed, when it was needed. This precision, this trust, this ability to save American lives through surgical application of firepower, this was what made the Skyraider irreplaceable in the Vietnamese jungle. The MiG-17 pilot couldn't believe what he was seeing through his canopy. Below him, lumbering through the sky at what seemed like walking speed, was one of those ancient American propeller planes. This was going to be the easiest kill of his career, a sitting duck that couldn't possibly escape his superior speed and firepower. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Van Bay had shot down 2 F-4 Phantoms and an F-105 Thunderchief in the past 6 months. Those had been real fights, high-speed chess matches between modern aircraft flown by skilled pilots. This was different. This was target practice against a museum piece that had no business sharing the same sky as his sophisticated Soviet-built fighter. The MiG-17 could reach 700 km/h in level flight, nearly twice the maximum speed of the lumbering Skyraider below. Bay's aircraft carried 20-30mm and 37mm cannons that could shred the aluminum skin of any American aircraft, plus air-to-air missiles for longer-range engagements. The propeller plane looked like it was held together with rivets and prayer. Bay rolled into a high-speed diving attack, confident that his superior velocity would carry him past the target before the American pilot could even react. This was standard MiG tactics: use speed to control the engagement, make a single devastating pass, then climb away before the enemy could respond. Against jets, this approach was highly effective. Against the Skyraider, it was about to become a fatal mistake. Captain Bill "Stump" Johnson saw the MiG coming from 3 miles away. The silver fighter was diving out of the sun, following a textbook intercept profile that would have worked perfectly against another jet. But Johnson wasn't flying a jet, and he wasn't going to play by jet fighter rules. Instead of trying to run or climb, both hopeless against the MiG's superior performance, Johnson did something that no jet pilot would ever consider. He chopped his throttles and pulled his Skyraider into the tightest possible turn, using every bit of his aircraft's low-speed maneuverability to change the geometry of the engagement. The physics of aerial combat suddenly worked against the MiG pilot. Bay's high-speed diving attack carried him past the Skyraider before he could get his guns lined up properly. His 700 closure rate, which should have been an overwhelming advantage, became a liability when his target suddenly wasn't where it was supposed to be. Bay pulled out of his dive and climbed for another attack, but now he faced a problem that Soviet training had never prepared him for. The Skyraider's turning radius at low speed was incredibly tight, much tighter than any jet could match. Every time the MiG pilot tried to line up for a shot, the propeller plane would turn inside his attack, forcing him to overshoot and start again. This was the turn and burn defensive strategy that a few experienced Skyraider pilots had developed through bitter experience. You couldn't outrun a jet, but you could outturn one. The key was forcing the enemy into a turning fight at low speed, where the A-1's superior maneuverability could overcome the jet's speed advantage. Johnson kept his Skyraider in a continuous hard turn, pulling as many Gs as the old airframe could handle. The Wright R-3350 engine roared at full power, but the aircraft's speed never exceeded 200 miles per hour. To the MiG pilot above, it must have looked like the American was flying in slow motion. Bay made 3 more attack passes, each one ending in frustration as his target turned inside his firing solution. The MiG's high stall speed meant he couldn't slow down enough to match the Skyraider's turning performance without falling out of the sky. He was trapped in a high-speed orbit around a low-speed target that refused to die. On the 4th pass, Johnson saw his opportunity. As the MiG pulled up from another failed attack run, it hung momentarily in the sky, bleeding energy from its climb. For just a few seconds, the sophisticated fighter was vulnerable, slow, predictable, and within range of the Skyraider's 20mm cannons. Johnson rolled his aircraft and opened fire. The explosive shells walked across the MiG's fuselage, punching through aluminum skin and severing control cables. The North Vietnamese pilot ejected as his aircraft began its death spiral toward the jungle below. The ultimate humiliation was complete. Jet-age technology had been beaten by a propeller plane using nothing more than superior tactics and pilot skill. The psychological impact rippled through the North Vietnamese Air Force. If their modern fighters couldn't handle an obsolete American relic, what did that say about their technological superiority? Word of the engagement spread quickly through both air forces. For American pilots, it was proof that experience and tactics could overcome raw performance. For the enemy, it was a sobering reminder that underestimating your opponent could be fatal, regardless of what aircraft you were flying. In the unforgiving skies over North Vietnam, there was no sound more terrifying to a downed American pilot than silence. The absence of friendly aircraft overhead meant you were alone in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces who would torture you for information before executing you as a war criminal. Your survival depended entirely on how quickly the rescue birds could reach you, and whether they could survive long enough to pull you out. The statistics were brutal and unforgiving. A downed pilot's chances of survival dropped by 50% for every hour he remained on the ground in enemy territory. After 6 hours, rescue became a body recovery mission. The North Vietnamese had learned to use downed airmen as bait, setting up killing zones around crash sites to destroy the rescue helicopters that would inevitably come looking for survivors. This was the nightmare scenario that led to the birth of the Sandys, the A-1 Skyraider pilots who specialized in search and rescue escort missions. The call sign wasn't chosen randomly. It honored Major Bernard Sandy Sands, an early SAR pilot who had died protecting a rescue helicopter during a particularly brutal mission over Laos. His sacrifice had demonstrated both the critical importance of escort aircraft and the deadly risks they faced. The search and rescue architecture in Vietnam was complex and dangerous, requiring perfect coordination between multiple aircraft types under the most stressful conditions imaginable. At the heart of the system were the HH-3 and HH-53 Jolly Green giant rescue helicopters, massive, heavily armed choppers capable of hovering in hostile territory while winching survivors to safety. But these helicopters were sitting ducks without proper escort protection. That's where the Sandys came in. A typical SAR mission would launch with 2 or more A-1 Skyraiders providing armed escort for the rescue helicopter. Their job was to suppress enemy ground fire, mark the survivor's location with smoke rockets, and literally fight to the death to protect the slower, more vulnerable Jolly Green during the extraction process. The sacred code that drove every Sandy pilot was simple and absolute: no pilot left behind. This wasn't just military doctrine, it was a blood oath that bound the rescue community together. Sandy pilots would fly into known kill zones, face overwhelming odds, and sacrifice their own lives without hesitation to save a fellow airman. The brotherhood was forged in the crucible of life and death missions where failure meant abandoning a comrade to torture and execution. But flying Sandy missions required a completely different breed of pilot. These weren't glory seekers hunting for MiG kills or trying to rack up impressive bomb damage assessments. Sandy pilots were flying into the most dangerous situations in military aviation, often against hopeless odds, with success measured not by enemy targets destroyed, but by American lives saved. The psychological profile of a Sandy pilot was unique in military aviation. They had to possess the tactical skills to survive in heavily defended airspace, while maintaining the emotional control to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. A Sandy pilot might have to choose between saving 1 downed airman or protecting the rescue helicopter carrying 3 crew members. These weren't theoretical dilemmas. They were split-second decisions made while flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire. The mission planning for SAR operations was incredibly complex. Sandy pilots had to study detailed maps of enemy territory, memorizing the locations of known anti-aircraft positions, escape routes, and potential landing zones for the rescue helicopters. They had to understand the capabilities and limitations of every aircraft type in the rescue package, coordinating their actions with helicopter crews who were focused entirely on the extraction process. Life and death decisions in hostile territory became routine for Sandy pilots. They would fly low-level reconnaissance missions to locate downed airmen, often drawing heavy ground fire to confirm that survivors were still alive. They would mark survivor locations with colored smoke rockets, providing reference points for the incoming rescue helicopters while simultaneously revealing their own positions to enemy gunners. The emotional weight of the mission was crushing. Sandy pilots knew that every decision they made could mean the difference between life and death for a fellow airman. Failed rescue attempts haunted them for years, the knowledge that they had been unable to save someone who was counting on them for survival. But successful rescues created bonds that lasted a lifetime, connections forged in the crucible of combat between men who had risked everything for each other. The brotherhood that developed among Sandy pilots was unlike anything else in military aviation. These were men who had stared death in the face together, who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their comrades, and who understood that their own survival depended entirely on the courage and skill of their fellow rescue pilots. The mindset of a Sandy pilot was fundamentally different from every other aviator in the Vietnam War. While fighter jocks chased MiGs for glory and bomber crews focused on strategic targets, Sandy pilots had embraced a mission that offered no medals, no recognition, and a statistical certainty of death or capture. They weren't hunting enemies. They were saving lives, one desperate rescue at a time. Captain Rick Guardian Martinez had flown 47 Sandy missions over North Vietnam, and each one had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. "You don't fly into a kill zone thinking about yourself," he remembered years later. "You're thinking about some poor bastard on the ground who's counting on you to get him home. That changes everything about how you approach the mission." The psychological transformation began with the first mission briefing. While other pilots studied target folders and bomb damage assessments, Sandy pilots memorized the personal details of the man they were trying to save. His name, his hometown, his wife's name, whether he had kids. This wasn't just professional courtesy, it was tactical necessity. A downed pilot's psychological state could determine whether he survived long enough for rescue, and knowing personal details helped Sandy pilots provide the emotional support that kept men alive in impossible situations. Flying into known kill zones required a complete inversion of normal survival instincts. Every pilot was trained to avoid anti-aircraft fire, to use speed and altitude to minimize exposure to ground threats. Sandy pilots did the opposite. They flew low and slow, deliberately drawing fire away from the more vulnerable rescue helicopters. They turned themselves into targets, using their own aircraft as bait to reveal enemy gun positions. The risk calculation was brutal and constant. Should you make another low pass to confirm the survivor's exact location, knowing it would expose you to concentrated ground fire? Should you engage that anti-aircraft position that's threatening the Jolly Green, even though it means flying directly into its field of fire? Every decision carried life and death consequences, not just for yourself, but for the entire rescue package. Martinez described the moment when training gave way to instinct. You stop thinking about the odds. You stop calculating your chances of survival. There's a guy down there who needs help, and you're the only one who can provide it. Everything else becomes secondary to that mission. The use of smoke rockets became both art and science for Sandy pilots. Different colored smoke had different meanings: red for enemy positions, yellow for friendly locations, white for general marking. But in the heat of combat, with multiple aircraft in the area and ground fire coming from all directions, placing smoke accurately required split-second timing and absolute precision. A smoke rocket dropped in the wrong location could guide the rescue helicopter into a trap instead of to safety. The emotional weight of failed rescue attempts was devastating. Sandy pilots would sometimes spend hours circling a crash site, taking heavy fire while trying to establish contact with survivors, only to discover that the downed airman had been killed on impact or captured by enemy forces. The knowledge that you had risked everything for nothing was crushing, but it never stopped them from launching on the next mission. But successful rescues created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Martinez had pulled 6 men out of enemy territory during his tour, and decades later, he still received Christmas cards from their families. Those weren't just successful missions, he said. Those were 6 men who got to go home to their wives and kids because we were willing to risk everything to get them out. The brotherhood forged in these life and death situations was absolute and unbreakable. Sandy pilots would fly with men they had never met before, but the shared understanding of the mission created instant trust and cooperation. They knew that every other pilot in the rescue package would sacrifice his own life without hesitation to save a downed comrade. This psychological transformation from individual survival to collective sacrifice was what made the Sandy pilots so effective and so feared by enemy forces. They couldn't be deterred by ground fire, couldn't be intimidated by overwhelming odds, and wouldn't abandon a rescue attempt no matter how hopeless it seemed. They had become something more than pilots. They had become guardians, protectors of the sacred promise that no American would be left behind in enemy territory. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Gene Hambleton was supposed to be flying a routine electronic reconnaissance mission over South Vietnam when his EB-66 destroyer was blown out of the sky by a surface-to-air missile on April 3, 1972. But Hambleton wasn't just another downed pilot. He was one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the American military, a man who knew virtually every detail of the classified electronic warfare systems that kept American aircraft alive over North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese understood exactly what they had stumbled into. Hambleton possessed knowledge that could compromise every electronic countermeasure, every radar jamming technique, and every classified frequency used by American forces. If they could capture him alive and extract that information through interrogation, it would be an intelligence coup that could shift the entire balance of the air war. What should have been a standard search and rescue mission immediately escalated into one of the largest and most desperate rescue operations of the Vietnam War. Hamilton had survived the shootdown and was hiding in dense jungle near the Mujiang River, deep in enemy territory and surrounded by North Vietnamese forces who were mobilizing everything they had to capture him. The initial rescue attempts were disasters that demonstrated just how valuable the enemy considered their prize. The first Jolly Green Giant helicopter to reach Hamilton's area was shot down by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, killing all 6 crew members. A second rescue helicopter suffered the same fate hours later. By the end of the first day, 12 Americans had died trying to save one man, and Hamilton was still on the ground. But the Pentagon couldn't afford to abandon him. The intelligence he carried was simply too sensitive to fall into enemy hands. The decision was made to launch Operation Thunderhead, a massive rescue effort that would ultimately involve over 800 sorties by American aircraft and cost the lives of 11 more airmen before it was over. This was where the Sandy pilots proved their worth beyond any doubt. While high-speed jets had failed to suppress the concentrated anti-aircraft defenses around Hamilton's position, the A-1 Skyraiders could loiter over the area for hours, providing constant protection and communication with the downed officer. Major Dave "Nail" Thorne led the Sandy flights that kept Hamilton alive during the most critical phase of his ordeal. Flying missions that lasted up to 8 hours, Thorne and his fellow A-1 pilots maintained continuous contact with the survivor, directing him away from enemy patrols and coordinating supply drops when possible. The sustained protection that only the Skyraider could provide turned what should have been a hopeless situation into a defendable position. Every time North Vietnamese forces closed in on Hamilton's hiding spot, the Sandys would appear overhead, driving them back with precise rocket and cannon fire. The A-1's ability to stay on station for hours meant that enemy forces could never be certain when it was safe to move in the open. For 11 days and nights, Hamilton played a deadly game of cat and mouse with his pursuers, while overhead, the Sandy pilots fought a continuous battle to keep him alive. The Skyraiders faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple directions, absorbing hits that would have destroyed any other aircraft while maintaining their protective vigil. The psychological warfare aspect was as important as the physical protection. North Vietnamese commanders knew that as long as those persistent propeller planes circled overhead, any attempt to capture Hamilton would result in devastating airstrikes. The A-1's reputation for accuracy and persistence had preceded it. Enemy forces had learned to fear the slow-moving aircraft that never seemed to leave and never seemed to die. The rescue operation finally succeeded on April 13th, when a combination of diversionary attacks and precise Sandy support allowed a forward air controller in a small observation aircraft to land near Hamilton's position and extract him personally. The operation had cost 13 American lives and millions of dollars in aircraft and ordnance, but it also demonstrated the absolute commitment to the principle that no pilot would be abandoned in enemy territory. The Bat-21 saga became legendary within the rescue community, proof that the Sandy pilots would face any odds and pay any price to bring their fellow airmen home. The sustained week-long effort had shown what the Skyraider could accomplish that no other aircraft could match, turning open ground into a defended fortress through sheer persistence and courage. The operation also marked a turning point in enemy respect for the A-1. North Vietnamese forces had learned that the slow, ugly propeller plane was far more dangerous than any sleek jet fighter when it came to protecting American lives. On March 10, 1966, Major Bernard Fisher was leading a flight of A-1 Skyraiders on a close air support mission near the A Shau Valley when everything went wrong. His wingman, Major Dafford "Jump" Myers, had been hit by ground fire during a strafing run and was going down fast. The damaged Skyraider limped toward a small airstrip at a Shau Special Forces camp, trailing smoke and losing altitude with every passing second. Fisher watched helplessly as Myers's aircraft touched down on the rough dirt runway, bounced once, and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. The good news was that Myers had survived the crash landing. The bad news was that A Shao was completely surrounded by North Vietnamese forces, who were already advancing toward the disabled aircraft. The Special Forces camp had been under siege for days, its small garrison of American advisors and South Vietnamese troops barely holding their perimeter against overwhelming enemy numbers. The airstrip was under constant mortar and small arms fire, making any rescue attempt suicidal. Standard procedure would have been to call for a helicopter extraction once the area was secured, but there was no time to secure anything. Fisher could see enemy soldiers running toward Myers's crashed Skyraider from multiple directions. Within minutes, they would reach the aircraft and either capture or kill the downed pilot. The nearest rescue helicopter was over an hour away, far too long for Myers to survive in the open. That's when Fisher made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to land his own A-1 on that fire-swept airstrip and pull Myers out himself. "Jump, this is Bernie. I'm coming down to get you. Get ready to run." The radio crackled back with Myers's voice, strained but determined. "Bernie, don't do it. This place is crawling with NVA. You'll never make it out." Fisher was already banking into his approach, lining up with the narrow dirt strip while tracers streaked past his canopy. "I'm not leaving you down there. Get ready to move when I touch down." What Fisher was attempting had never been done before in combat. Landing an A-1 Skyraider on a hostile airstrip under fire was dangerous enough, but taking off again with an extra passenger pushed the aircraft beyond its design limits. The Skyraider wasn't built for two people. There was barely room for Myers to squeeze into the tiny space behind the pilot's seat. The approach was a nightmare of concentrated ground fire. North Vietnamese soldiers were firing everything they had at the slow-moving target, from AK-47s to heavy machine guns. Fisher's Skyraider shuddered under multiple impacts as bullets punched through the wings and fuselage, but the tough old bird kept flying. He touched down hard on the rough strip, bouncing and skidding as he fought to maintain control. Before the aircraft had even stopped rolling, Myers was running toward him, bent low to avoid the bullets snapping overhead. Enemy soldiers were less than 100 yards away and closing fast. Myers dove headfirst into the cramped space behind Fisher's seat, squeezing himself into a position that would have been uncomfortable in peacetime and was nearly impossible under combat conditions. "Go! Go! Go!" he shouted over the engine noise and gunfire. Fisher pushed the throttles forward and started his takeoff roll while bullets continued to pepper the aircraft. The Skyraider was overloaded, underpowered for the extra weight, and running out of runway fast. The aircraft lifted off just as enemy soldiers reached the edge of the airstrip, their muzzle flashes visible in Fisher's mirrors. But they weren't clear yet. The overloaded A-1 climbed sluggishly, barely clearing the trees at the end of the runway, while ground fire continued to track them. Fisher kept the aircraft low, using terrain features to mask their escape route, while Myers tried to make himself as small as possible in the cramped rear compartment. The flight back to base was tense but uneventful. Fisher's Skyraider had absorbed dozens of hits during the rescue, but the aircraft's legendary durability had carried them through. Both men were alive, both were going home, and the sacred code of the rescue community had been upheld. 3 months later, President Lyndon Johnson presented Major Bernard Fisher with the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. The citation read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But for Fisher and every other Sandy pilot, the medal represented something more important than personal recognition. It was proof that the Brotherhood of Rescue would never abandon a fellow airman, regardless of the odds or the cost. By the spring of 1967, something had fundamentally changed in the North Vietnamese approach to air defense. Intelligence reports filtering back to American commanders told a story that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The enemy was specifically targeting A-1 Skyraiders with a level of resources and attention previously reserved for strategic bombers and high-value reconnaissance aircraft. The transformation was stark and undeniable. Early in the war, NVA gunners had treated Skyraider encounters as target practice, easy kills that would boost morale and provide propaganda value. Now, captured documents revealed detailed tactical manuals specifically devoted to engaging slow-moving propeller aircraft. The mockery had been replaced by something far more dangerous: professional respect backed by deadly intent. Enemy recognition of the Skyraider threat had evolved through bitter experience. North Vietnamese commanders had watched their supply convoys systematically destroyed by aircraft they had dismissed as obsolete. They had seen their most heavily defended positions suppressed by planes that absorbed punishment no jet could survive. Most critically, they had witnessed their attempts to capture high-value prisoners thwarted by persistent aerial guardians that refused to leave the battlefield. The tactical shift was comprehensive and coordinated. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been positioned to engage high-speed, high-altitude targets were being repositioned and retrained to deal with low and slow threats. New firing techniques were developed specifically for tracking aircraft flying at Skyraider speeds and altitudes. Gun crews practiced engaging targets that could turn tighter than any jet and absorb hits that would destroy more modern aircraft. But the most ominous development was the enemy's focus on sandy pilots during rescue operations. North Vietnamese forces had identified the critical role that A-1 Skyraiders played in search and rescue missions, and they had developed specific tactics to exploit this knowledge. Instead of simply trying to capture downed pilots, enemy forces began using survivors as bait to draw in the rescue aircraft. The new tactics were coldly calculated and brutally effective. NVA units would allow downed pilots to establish radio contact with potential rescuers, then set up elaborate kill zones around the crash sites. Heavy anti-aircraft weapons would be moved into position during the night, creating concentrated fields of fire designed specifically to engage the slow-moving sandy aircraft that would inevitably come looking for survivors. Captain Mike Rescue Thompson experienced this tactical evolution firsthand during a mission over Laos in late 1967. It was like they knew exactly what we were going to do before we did it, he remembered. They had studied our rescue procedures, learned our communication frequencies, and positioned their guns to create perfect killing fields for A-1s. This wasn't random ground fire. This was a coordinated ambush designed specifically for Skyraiders. The increased anti-aircraft defenses around downed pilots created a vicious tactical dilemma for sandy pilots. They couldn't abandon rescue attempts. The sacred code of leaving no man behind was absolute and non-negotiable. But every rescue mission now carried the near certainty of flying into carefully prepared kill zones where enemy forces had concentrated overwhelming firepower specifically designed to destroy their aircraft. Intelligence reports from the period show the extent of enemy tactical adaptation. North Vietnamese units were dedicating significant resources to studying Skyraider operations, analyzing flight patterns, and developing countermeasures. The aircraft that had once been ignored as a minor threat was now receiving attention typically reserved for strategic weapon systems. The respect that replaced initial contempt came at a terrible price. Enemy forces were no longer content to simply avoid Skyraider attacks. They were actively hunting the aircraft with sophisticated tactics and concentrated firepower. The days when A-1 pilots could rely on enemy dismissal and overconfidence were over. The North Vietnamese had learned to fear the slow-moving propeller plane, and fear had made them far more dangerous opponents. This tactical evolution marked a turning point in the air war over Vietnam. The Skyraiders' growing reputation as an effective weapon system had made it a priority target for enemy forces who understood that destroying the Guardian Angels would leave American ground forces and downed pilots defenseless against overwhelming odds. By 1970, the writing was on the wall for the A-1 Skyraider. The Pentagon had finally developed jet aircraft that could match, or at least approach, the old propeller plane's unique capabilities in close air support and rescue operations. The A-7 Corsair II promised to deliver precision ordnance with jet speed, while the experimental A-10 Warthog was being designed specifically for the low and slow missions that had made the Skyraider so effective. The A-7 Corsair II represented everything the military brass wanted in a modern attack aircraft. It could fly twice as fast as the Skyraider while carrying a comparable weapons load, and its sophisticated navigation and targeting systems promised accuracy that human pilots could never match. The aircraft looked like the future, sleek, fast, and packed with the latest electronic warfare systems that would supposedly make close air support safer and more effective. The A-10 Warthog was even more promising from a tactical standpoint. Designed around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, it was built specifically for the tank-killing and close air support missions that had become the Skyraider's specialty. Its twin engines and heavy armor provided survivability, while its relatively low speed made precision attacks possible. On paper, the A-10 was everything the A-1 was, only better. But jet technology finally matching propeller plane capabilities wasn't the only factor driving the Skyraider's retirement. Political pressure to modernize the fleet had been building for years, driven by congressional critics who couldn't understand why the world's most advanced military was still flying aircraft designed during World War II. Defense contractors were eager to sell new jets, and Pentagon procurement officials were tired of defending their reliance on obsolete technology. The image problem was real and persistent. Every time a Skyraider appeared in news footage or military documentaries, it reinforced the perception that American forces were using outdated equipment. The aircraft's ungainly appearance and obvious age made it a propaganda liability in a conflict where technological superiority was supposed to demonstrate American strength. Official phase-out orders began filtering down through the chain of command in late 1971, despite vigorous protests from pilots who had flown the A-1 in combat. Squadron commanders who had watched Skyraiders save countless lives and complete impossible missions found themselves defending aircraft that had been declared obsolete by officials who had never heard a Wright R-3350 engine under fire. The protests were emotional and well-founded. Sandy pilots argued that no jet aircraft could provide the sustained, precise fire support that made rescue operations possible. Close air support specialists insisted that the A-1's ability to loiter over friendly forces for hours was irreplaceable. Even maintenance crews joined the opposition, pointing out that the Skyraider's mechanical simplicity made it far more reliable than the complex electronic systems that kept breaking down on newer aircraft. Captain Dave Last Call Rodriguez flew one of the final A-1 combat missions over Vietnam in October 1972. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend who had saved your life 100 times, he remembered. That airplane had brought me home from missions that should have killed me. Now some Pentagon bureaucrat was telling me it was obsolete. The emotional final flights were ceremonies of mourning disguised as military operations. Pilots who had trusted their lives to the Skyraider's durability and reliability found themselves transitioning to aircraft that were faster and more sophisticated, but somehow felt less trustworthy. The mechanical certainty of the radial engine was replaced by the electronic complexity of jet systems that could fail in ways no pilot fully understood. Veterans gathered at air bases across Southeast Asia to watch the last Skyraiders taxi out for their final missions. Maintenance crews who had patched bullet holes and kept the old birds flying stood at attention as aircraft that had become family members disappeared into the sky for the last time. Ground troops who owed their lives to A-1 close air support watched their guardian angels fly away forever. The end of an era in military aviation was marked not by celebration of technological progress, but by genuine grief for the loss of something irreplaceable. The Skyraider had proven that sometimes the old ways really were the best ways, that reliability and persistence could triumph over speed and sophistication. But progress demanded sacrifice, and the price of modernization was the retirement of the most effective close air support aircraft ever built. The pilots' mournful farewell to their guardian angel echoed across every airfield where Skyraiders had served, a final tribute to the ugly, slow, magnificent airplane that had redefined what it meant to never leave a comrade behind. When the last American combat troops withdrew from Vietnam in March 1973, they left behind more than just military bases and equipment. They left behind an entire air force that had grown to depend on the A-1 Skyraider as the backbone of its combat operations. For the South Vietnamese Air Force, the aging propeller planes weren't just aircraft. They were symbols of national independence and the promise that they could defend their country without American help. The VNAF had fallen in love with the Skyraider for all the same reasons American pilots had learned to respect it. The aircraft was simple enough for their mechanics to maintain with limited resources, tough enough to survive the kind of battle damage that would ground more sophisticated jets, and effective enough to provide the close air support that South Vietnamese ground forces desperately needed. But there was something deeper in the relationship between Vietnamese pilots and their Skyraiders. These were aircraft that didn't require years of advanced technical training or sophisticated support systems. A competent pilot could learn to fly the A-1 effectively in months rather than years, and a small crew of mechanics could keep it operational with basic tools and spare parts. For a developing nation trying to build an independent air force, the Skyraider represented achievable capability rather than impossible sophistication. The training programs established for VNAF pilots reflected this practical approach. American instructors focused on the basics: how to maintain controlled flight at minimum speeds, how to place ordnance accurately from low altitude, how to survive in heavily defended airspace using armor and persistence rather than speed and altitude. These weren't glamorous skills, but they were exactly what the South Vietnamese needed to defend their homeland. Major Nguyen Van Duc had trained on jets in the United States, but he chose to fly Skyraiders when he returned to Vietnam. The A-1 was an honest airplane, he remembered years later. It would tell you exactly what it was going to do, and it would do exactly what you told it to do. There were no surprises, no electronic systems that could fail at the worst possible moment. Just a pilot, an engine, and whatever weapons you could carry. The final combat missions flown by VNAF Skyraiders after American withdrawal were desperate affairs that showcased both the aircraft's capabilities and the courage of the men who flew them. With limited fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, Vietnamese pilots continued flying close air support missions for ground forces who were facing overwhelming odds against well-equipped North Vietnamese regulars. These missions had a different character from the earlier American operations. VNF pilots were fighting for their homes, their families, and their nation's survival. Every sortie carried personal stakes that went far beyond military objectives. When a Skyraider pilot dove through anti-aircraft fire to support a surrounded outpost, he might be protecting his own brother's unit or defending the village where his parents lived. The aircraft's durability became even more critical as the war entered its final phase. With American logistical support cut off, every Skyraider had to be kept flying regardless of battle damage or mechanical problems. VNAF maintenance crews performed miracles of improvisation, fabricating replacement parts from scrap metal and keeping engines running with whatever oil and fuel they could find. But by early 1975, even the tough old Skyraiders couldn't overcome the reality of South Vietnam's strategic situation. North Vietnamese forces were advancing with modern Soviet equipment, while VNAF squadrons struggled to maintain aging aircraft with dwindling supplies. The end was approaching fast, and everyone knew it. The desperate escapes as Saigon fell in April 1975 included some of the most dramatic final flights in aviation history. VNAF pilots loaded their families into Skyraiders and flew toward Thailand or aircraft carriers offshore, abandoning everything they had known for the uncertain promise of refuge in foreign lands. Some made it to safety. Others ran out of fuel over the South China Sea and were never seen again. The captured aircraft that remained behind faced a different fate under communist control. North Vietnamese forces, who had learned to fear and respect the Skyraider during years of combat, initially planned to incorporate the aircraft into their own air force. But the A-1's complexity and maintenance requirements proved beyond their capabilities without American technical support. Most of the remaining Skyraiders were eventually scrapped or left to deteriorate in the tropical climate. The aircraft that had symbolized South Vietnamese independence became rusting monuments to a nation that no longer existed. The end of the Skyraider's combat service marked not just the retirement of an aircraft type, but the final chapter of a war that had defined a generation. The A-1 Skyraider's legacy transcends every measure of military effectiveness. It proved that appropriate technology beats advanced technology when the mission demands reliability over sophistication. The lesson echoes through decades of military history. The most complex solution isn't always the best solution. Pilot loyalty to the plane that always brought them home created bonds that lasted lifetimes. The NVA's journey from mockery to fear and respect validated old-school toughness in modern warfare's crucible.